Okay, so now that you have an idea of what you want to do with pictures, make sure you're using lots and do it as many as you need to make sure that they're coming up with really interesting associative words. And then you've walked them through the voice chart so they understand clearly that you're not expecting them just to point out things, but really make a connection as to why things matter. You're going to want to then give them a chart to use when they do a passage. Maybe they're going to do the Scrooge passage. So make sure you give them a chart that has a place for them to write their evidence down, a place to label it so they know that they're looking at images or diction. I like these words, or I like the image that's created by these words or this idea. These are some associative claims I make when I read or see this. And then some area to write down their pink pattern. I see repetitive diction, words like unfeeling and miserable, and then here's what I think, why it matters. So why does that matter? Have them fill that part out. So over here, they might have a couple boxes that look like repetitive diction, unfeeling and miserly. It creates a feeling of blah. Make sense? So we give them that chart and then give it to them filled out if you want already halfway, or give it to them blank and let them work through it with you. And then give them this passage or a passage of your own choosing. But this is what I've been modeling a lot, and I find that kids recognize it a lot because everyone kind of knows the story of Scrooge. So I might walk through the first part of it with them and then have them work on it in partners for the remainder of the time that I allot for the activity. So I might say, read this aloud. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. And I'll ask, does anyone like anything in that? Are there words that they use? Is there an image that's created to you? What do you like? And little Susie might say, oh, I like that he keeps his eye upon his clerk. So I'll say, great. Underline that, eye upon his clerk. And then either on my chart right away, I'll write it down, or I'll save some time and copy down the best ones. So I might say eye upon his clerk. Give me 2 words that you think of associatively when he says he keeps his eye on his clerk. How does that make you feel? Ooh, it makes me feel mistrusting and scrutinized. So they might write here out to the side, mistrusting and scrutiny. If we went on, we might say words like dismal little cell. Oh, that's a great image. Dismal just means associatively depressing, anxious, prison-like, constricting. And so there's a real contrast here between where he is, this counting house, and where he keeps his employees, a dismal little cell. So he separates himself. There's a definite contrast. And he watches them, almost like a prison guard would a prisoner. If we continue, we might say Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel, the master predicted it would be necessary for them to part. So we might look at this section and say, is there anything in there that we like? Maybe we like the fact that he only has a small fire and he keeps it for himself. So we might underline that he predicted that it would be necessary for them to part and say miserly, stingy, cruel, unobservant, uncaring, lacking empathy. So we might say that for the associations there. And then to continue reading, wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. Maybe we don't get anything from that, so we move on. You want to make sure that they know that they don't have to pick apart everything. I would say 1 or 2 really good pieces of evidence per paragraph, maybe even in this whole section, is plenty. Not everything is powerful and poignant, but they want to make sure they get enough so that they have something on which to work. So as they walk through this, they might pick up on the fact that he bah humbugs people, and he's dismissive of people. Good afternoon. Happy New Year. Oh, good afternoon, I said. at the bottom. So over and over again, it kind of repeats his miserly, stingy, cruel, dismissive personality. So they'll write these words. On their chart, they will then start to identify that. If we look at the examples that we wrote down, what were their best 5 favorite pieces, and they might write them in here and then copy down those associative claims they put out in the margins. They're going to start looking and seeing patterns. Look at the contrast between the nephew, fresh, spirited, full of life and possibilities, and our first reaction to Scrooge, miserly, superior, miserable, oppressive. This is real contrast. What is Dickens trying to say with the contrast between these characters? What is he telling us about the human condition? Over and over, when we look at Scrooge, we see cynical and angry and fixated. What is he telling us with the repetition of these ideas with Scrooge? We know that eventually Scrooge shifts, but we can't talk about that shift. We can't talk about that change in his personality because it's not in this passage. So what is this initial passage of the Christmas Carol trying to convey to us about Scrooge's personality? That's what they would focus on here. And then once they have done that, that's when they're going to start writing in claims. Okay, they found something and now they have something to say in answer. If you gave them a prompt that said, how is Dickens characterizing Scrooge in this passage? They could clearly say, Scrooge is characterized as miserly, repeatedly. Scrooge's untrusting and managing personality makes him a cynical, angry, miserable man. And these are the words that they're having difficulty coming up with as they think on their own. So this is a way for them to brainstorm and then use these words over and over and over because they thought them in the beginning and they don't want to lose that train of thought.